Hey everybody, it's Vanessa. Welcome back to another video in our La Family quilt along that we're working on. Last video I showed y'all how to cut out all the pieces that you need to make the second block. So as of right now, we have all the individual components to make that block. And then you should have also created 10 blocks that look identical to each other and that look like this. So that's block number 1. Now we're going to get to piecing block number 2. And as you can recall from the diagram, all the outermost patchwork pieces are all squares. The only one that needs to be pieced together to make a square are the 4 little pieces of the triangles that we have here to create the center block. So let's line them up so you see how they look. All right, so we are going to go to the sewing machine and take all our little pieces because we got to make 10 units like this, one for the center of each of the 10 blocks that we need to create for block number 2. And I'm going to show you how to sew them together. For this, sometimes it's helpful to kind of line things up correctly so that you don't end up sewing something like this. Okay, you want to make sure that the greens are opposite sides of each other, and the same thing for the darker fabric here. So we are first going to sew these two along this seam. We'll do the same thing for this one. Okay, and then we'll combine the two, making sure that the points intersect nicely right there at the center. And if you notice, I said we need to sew these two here, and we need to sew these two here. If I turn these around, look what happens. They are in the exact same orientation as the other ones. So you can really grab your stack and place them in that orientation already. So I can just grab one and sew it together. And I'm going to do that. There should be 20 sets here because one will be one side, and then I will take another one and turn it around and sew it together. So this is a great and efficient way to go through and chain piece all your units together. So let's grab these 2 stacks, making sure that I line them up this way so that I sew here. Visually set your stuff up, grab it the same way that it is, and do not move it. Now let's head over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch all of these up. Now for pressing my units, I went ahead and pressed them all so that the seam allowance is going to the dark. Because the dark fabric is going to be opposite of itself like this, if you press all the pieces with the seam allowance going in the same direction, when you go back to combine them, they're actually going to abut nicely in opposite directions. You'll get less bulk here, and this will make it a lot easier to sew, and it will also ensure that you get a nice intersection from all 4 patchwork pieces right in the center of that unit. I always press first in the same way that it was sewn to set those stitches. Then I'll open it up and press the seam allowance to the dark side, which in this fabric combination is the black fabric. So I push and press, and then I've done the exact same thing for all of them. So all of these units have the seam allowance going towards the black. Now for sewing them together, just grab 2. Make sure that they're opposite like this. And all you got to do is make sure that the seam allowances right there where they touch is nice and flat as it goes through the sewing machine. For me, I can go ahead and do this without any pins. If you feel like you need a pin, you can go ahead and put one, but you can see that it's not that large of a unit and it fits comfortably in my hands. So I am just going to make sure that this is where I want it to, that intersecting point, and then just hold it as I go. after all those center units, you should have 10 of them completed. Go ahead and grab an ironing board and your iron. We're going to press it first just as it was sewn, and then I will open it up and just press the seam allowance to one side. And you'll see we get a really nice intersection right in the center of this unit. After you're done pressing all your 10 units, you're going to want to go in and trim away the dog ears. And the dog ears are the little extra parts that are sticking out on the corners. All right, so these 10 are done, one for the center of each of the remaining 10 blocks we have to make. And if you look at the diagram, you can see that they all come together like a simple 9-patch block, the same way that we did block number 1. So that tells me that this center square has to measure the exact same measurements as the rest of the squares that we have cut out. So if you recall, all the other A squares here were 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And that means this guy here should also measure 4.5 at this point. Now, once it's all pieced together. So I happen to have a handy little 4.5-inch ruler here. And you can see that that's pretty good. So I like to just go through and double check them. And what I do is I try not to cut too much off of one side or the other. I will line it up centered so that the line on my ruler that is going across the diagonal, this 45-degree angle black line you see here, I line it up along the diagonal of my block. Right in the center point should be right there. And then I will just trim away these tiny little slivers. And I use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that's why I still have a little that I can trim away. If you used a chunky 1/4 inch seam allowance, you may find that you might be short. So on things like this, where it's multiple patchwork pieces coming together to create one block that is then going to be a component of a larger block, I tend to go a little narrower on the seam allowance so that if I have to, I can trim down. But there's not going to be a way for you to really make it larger if you're very short. You'll have to take out the seams and re-sew it, okay? Now here's a tip for those of you that may need to trim down just as I am doing here. If you line up 4.5 inches flush on one side and the other, you may find that this diagonal line is going to be off center. So you can't just trim off that way, because although you may still have 4 pieces here, you may be cutting too much off of one side or another. So what you want to aim for, and this is one of the reasons I love these Olfa rulers, is you see where we talked about the diagonal already, this line going across 45-degree angle, and I'm lining up that line with the diagonal of my patchwork. But then at the 2.25 inch mark, do you see how if I count down from this top edge, this is 1 inch, this is 2 inch, and then that's giving me an extra little 1/4 inch. The intersection of this diagonal and that point right there, the bottom left corner of this little square, that's around the number 2, is where my centermost point should be. So if it is not there, then you may have this swung up too high. You may be trimming away too much off of one side, and you're not maintaining the proportion of the little patchwork unit that's made up of 4 equal-sized triangles. So I'm centering that intersection right in the center there. and then again along the diagonal with the line on the ruler. And then whatever is exposed on the outside, I know I can trim away. And another way to double check that you're lining it up right is if the corner of your ruler is exactly split at a 45-degree angle and it's made up of both fabrics. If I see that my angle is like that, like I have too much black fabric and not enough green, then I know that this is off. That line should be right along the diagonal and splitting that 90-degree corner exactly in half. Once you have the first block layout correctly, then go ahead and, as we've done before in a previous video to make the first block, I just kind of put 10, right, of the same ones on each thing. You're going to layer this whole thing up so that you can create 10 identical blocks. So all of these guys are going to go in this corner. And this is just the way that I like to do it so that I can visually see what all I'm doing. I'm not too worried about the direction of my prints for a quilt like this. But you can just split these up, you know, make sure that you have 10 in each stack. Then we'll take all these over to the sewing machine and start to sew them together, row by row by row, and then we'll start to combine the rows until we end up with 10 completed quilt blocks.